Thank you. So here we are on the 5th of December, trying to fix the world's problems and the immigration
That's right.
show. So we had said that we would talk about international migration.
Mhm.
Maybe we didn't do as much research as possible, but I did think about it on the drive on the flight home today, and I thought, so anyway,
Yeah, I don't
so
have
I
any
think
particular links to specific stories, but I keep some track of what's going on around the world, so I have a general idea of what each country is doing or not doing about it. So hopefully, I can say something intelligent along the way.
and Carolyn Vance will always say something
Yeah.
intelligent.
Yeah, I've got a couple stories. They're not recent. I mean, they're from the last few months, but they're not like brand new. But
Well,
yeah.
when we're ready for brand new, I think we should watch the TikTok together and see what your reaction is.
Mm.
Yeah, I'd like to see that. I couldn't get the link to work on my phone, so I'm looking
Oh,
forward.
yeah. The one you sent earlier. Yeah, I saw that. That was good.
Yeah. So everybody thinks that the U.S. is the only one with immigration problems,
Nope.
right?
Mhm.
And it's so far from truth. As in many things, we're just very egocentric.
Yeah.
Think we have the biggest problems, like we're gonna have the biggest solutions. But what I find interesting is that anywhere there's a border, there's a potential for crossovers, and there is. Every single day, there are people going back and forth.
Yeah.
Uh, Visas or not, every country has its own rules with each other. Uh, and the sad part is that no one really has the full solution of a back and forth under crisis. On an everyday, everybody just gets used to what's happening. Um, and it was here in Urbana after I got here that I realized that uh, migration is just a human phenomenon.
Hmm.
Um, it's when I barely started looking at 100 years ago with full numbers. And in the US, it's just the same as it's always been. There's ebbs and
Mhm.
flows, and then there's necessity, there's problems. And sometimes it affects us, and sometimes it affects other parts of the world, whether it's a war, a tsunami, or just an economic uh, fall in one of the countries, that borders you, then things happen. And so for me, that was a realization late in my life. I was probably in my 40s when I realized that the thing that I've been working on, we were not unique. And therefore, it relieves some of the tension that I had
Hmm.
about it. If this is just a human phenomenon that varies by time, uh, then looking back, and now I've done immigration history 101 10 times or more. I think the United States as a phenomenon is just as well as others. It doesn't matter that we think that we have everything and everybody wants to be here,
Yeah.
right? If and I cited with you guys, if Mexicans really wanted to come here, we got a 2,000-mile border, and we've got uh, over 200 million Mexicans.
Hmm.
If the U.S. were the destination, it would be no trouble for Mexicans to come in real mass numbers.
Yeah.
Uh, but of course, that is happening in many other places in the world.
Hmm.
The outsurge from Africa is right now present in my mind. Uh, but of course, the Ukraine, uh, in some countries being better than others, several years of migration to Europe, uh, you know, uh, Syria, Lebanon. I mean, you just name it. There is migration.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Lebanon. I don't know its current status, but at one point, just a few years ago, like 1 in 3 people in Lebanon was an immigrant, a refugee. Not a refugee in the legal sense of the term, but a lot of
Yeah,
Syrians, a lot
Yeah.
of people from other countries.
they have left. I recently was in the Pacific, uh, and we had reports from Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, and just Polynesia in general. And the migration there that is happening is very interesting to me. Uh, my person from, well, and he was actually talking about Samoa, but he works in Guam, and he was explaining to us how it looks somewhat like Puerto Rico in that their legal status as a territory creates a magnet for people to do uh, to arrive to somewhere in Micronesia, to Guam, to then the United States proper when it comes to uh, not just the mainland, but Hawaii and other places. That is, the territory status uh, makes the border uh, not the responsibility of the federal government. And therefore, what's their incentive for keeping people off their islands? And then once they're there, moving around in officially U.S. territories. So, anyway, I had never heard that those flows, but it made sense.
Yeah, I have a friend at church. He's Filipino and he grew up in Guam before coming to the U.S. Um,
Yeah.
and I don't know his whole history, but
Yeah, there are flows there too into the U.S. But today we decided to talk a little bit about what other countries are doing and what's happening. We may learn some lessons, we may learn some failures, but even those can be lessons, right? So anyway, does anybody have an instance or an article that you're?
yeah. Britain is doing some kind of version of Remain in Mexico. Well, no, it's actually worse. Um, they contracted apparently with Rwanda to take their deportees. And the article that I have is a couple months old, but I found something more recent online, like more like a year old. Now, if I can find it again. Um, but yeah, so they've apparently they've started sending asylum seekers to Rwanda. They've had a lot of legal challenges doing that. So the first ship was stopped. But these are people that do not want to go to Rwanda. Some have been there and had bad experiences. Um, Rwanda frames it as let me see if I can find it. Uh, so Rwanda's president Paul Kagame has said his government is motivated by altruism and a moral responsibility to provide a solution to a very complicated problem all over the world. England isn't the only country that's doing that. Apparently, Denmark is also signed a pact to do the same thing. Israel has sent people to Rwanda.
Now, I had not heard about this.
Yeah, I came across an article in the New York Times, and so I've been searching to see if there's anything more recent about that, which I found a little bit more recent. A lot of Congolese are there. One Congolese refugee who had been there and escaped says, "I am not in Rwanda, but I know I am never safe," because the Rwandans were pursuing him for some 2018 protest or something over not enough food at the place in Rwanda. So depending who you talk to, some people put a good face on it, and some people like, this country has a lot of human rights problems going back, and this is probably not a very good idea. But I guess it's one way that Britain is trying to defuse. I mean, Britain's also been accused of having horrible detention centers. So they're trying to, I guess, defuse the pressure on their detention centers, but they're also trying to, just be done with certain of these asylum seekers as well. So it's not the prettiest of pictures.
Yeah, there are a lot of places where they are simply turning people back away, like
Yeah.
Greece, for example. And there's a huge public relations nightmare to do that. So I think countries like U.S. and maybe U.K. and some others have taken note of this a long time ago and like, okay, we still don't want to take everybody in, but let's figure out some way where it just doesn't look as bad as it really is. So that Remain in Mexico is part of that. Sending people to Rwanda apparently is part of that. The whole keeping the Trump's Title 42 or whatever in place was part of that. It's just all ways to like keep the numbers down without it officially looking like you're doing something to do that.
Yeah.
I think is it Poland right now that is actually building a wall on the border to keep out the people, or is it
There's Hungary sounds like more like that's something they would do, but you may be right about. Let me just Google that.
I think it was border with Belarus or something like that. I'm confused right
now. That's exactly it. There's earlier this year they were talking about the wall.
Yeah, I found a January article. Yeah, Poland starts building a wall through protected forest at Belarus border.
Yeah, so it's like there are no new ideas under the sun. They're just articulated by a new person every so often.
Yeah.
The Great Wall of China was an example of that many, many years ago. It's like, barbarians? No, we don't want them. Let's build a wall.
I hadn't thought about that in the context of immigration, but that probably was true.
I mean, it wasn't exactly immigration that they were worried about, but it's the same.
It was armed immigration, but it was immigration.
Yeah.
Invasion.
Immigration. Very
which that word gets used when talking about immigrants.
Yes, exactly.
It's a false picture, but
yeah. And by the way, the Great Wall in China did not work. So it looks cool, and everybody likes to visit it, but it was not successful at keeping the Mr. Khan and his minions out of the country at that time. So
yeah, they still got wiped out like everybody else.
Yeah.
Well, when we're ready, I have two articles that I've been thinking of. One, to finish my own loop, Latin Americans coming to the States is only one of destinations. Recently, of course, to Venezuela and Colombia, we've had, now back to the flow from Venezuela out. So amongst those countries, there's lots of migration, again, because of the common needs. But I think one that often gets neglected is the immigration between or from Latin America to Spain, the mother country. Because we often talk about whoever goes back to Britain. But in Spain, it's very interesting because they have over 5 million immigrants in their population, and 1.5 of those millions come from Latin America. And then, as you know, the U.S. is having problems as to what do we do with certain people coming over, certain Latin Americans, especially Venezuelans. We don't have relations with them. We can't send them back, And so what do we do when they arrive here and they ask for asylum and we don't want them? The U.S. government doesn't want them here. So back in June, and as you know, Biden has been trying to figure out what do we do. And this week they announced a whole bunch of stuff that it doesn't look much different than Trump. But back in June, Biden was asking formally from Spain and Canada to increase its intake of migrants, including those that the U.S. didn't want. So we forget that, they probably have a team on immigration trying to fix the U.S. problem and hand it off to somebody else. And in
Right.
this case, Spain very gracefully said, we do have a shortage of workers. We probably would want more Latin Americans, but it's not because Washington is asking us
Right.
that will change our policy. It doesn't go very well. It's almost like mentioning Chicago, downstate. It's just not a good thing to say we're doing it because they want us. On the other hand, Mexico has had an unofficial policy, at least with two recent presidents, that will do something if you pay us for it,
Mm-hmm.
and we'll help you with your problem. Uh, so anyway, so I found that one interesting, to I don't know, recalibrate myself, recenter myself on those numbers, uh, because of course during and that this one is related. The World Cup is going on, and Qatar has been vilified. Some say very rightfully as the worst World Cup.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, they spent gobs and gobs of money to build, to receive people. But I heard it yesterday. All the people in Qatar that are citizens would fit in 2 or 3 of the stadiums that they built. Uh, and 95% or something like that is of the present residents in Qatar are migrant workers.
Mm-hmm.
And then the millions that have arrived because of the games. But the controversy there, which we can have here, is uh, that there's been a lot of deaths in building the stadiums
Oh yeah.
for the games. And they've been migrant deaths because they're the ones building things.
Right.
Uh, as what's his name, who says that if you want the job done, you give it to an immigrant. Anyway, pop singers put stuff in our heads. Um, but anyway, so I just thought that those movements get neglected except because of the spotlight of the game or a particular picture from Syria. Uh, but countries all over Europe are doing their own intaking. And then the countries, the Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, they're intaking. Chile, a lot of news about them taking people from Venezuela right
Yeah,
now.
yeah. Initially, I don't think the Venezuelans were interested in coming here, and they went to other countries in Latin America. But I think I read that because of COVID, some of them are having a hard time finding work and whatever. So that put additional pressure where they started coming over the southern border.
And I think if I'm remembering this right, that the U.S. put a rule that you can't come directly from Venezuela. You must fly in from another country to here. And if you fly in, you'll be taken in. You'll
I
be
think it's
received as
something like that.
Venezuelan.
Yeah.
I do remember reading that those that will be allowed to come in legally have to fly in, but I didn't know it was from another country.
I think that's right. I
Is
don't
it?
remember specifically, but I have some recollection of that. Like you can't
I'll,
come
I'll
straight.
research it so I can correct myself. It's always so much better when somebody else doesn't correct
Yeah,
me.
that
Um,
does make sense. We probably don't have any direct flights from Venezuela if we don't have relations with Venezuela.
Yeah.
yeah. They'll take their oil, just not their people.
Right. Yeah, that's the other really strange thing. Your comment about Qatar and the workers reminded me that there's all sorts of things flying back and forth across borders all the time. There's goods, there's and even services, people providing services going back and forth. It's just the people that want to stay that are considered a problem, and it. That's one reason why it's so difficult to gain any control because Trump's really foolish notion of building a wall and just closing the borders was ridiculous. You can't do that unless suddenly all manufacturing is done in this country. Everything is done here. We're not buying raw materials from anywhere else. All that stuff. There's just it would have been no way to do that. So they were trying to figure out a way to keep out people who wanted to come here and live or work for extended periods of time and not keep out anybody else. And that was it's a nightmare. There's just not possible.
Yeah. Well, and people forget that the borders are often crossing people's families and whatever else. So, whether you have a Palestine within Israel or whatever, I just want to go see my mom. My mom is sick.
Yeah.
Right? And she ended up on that side of the border. We ended up on this side. I've related to you guys before that my siblings thought that we were the first immigrant to the U.S. And now I have evidence of back and forth, literally back and forth. Some Mexican of my family's moving to the U.S. and then some people from New Mexico moving to our hometowns in Chihuahua. Because back then things were better, So anyway, again, time is the one that tells us that this is not a new issue.
Yeah, well, World War II was a huge stirring of the pot, the world pot, in terms of people. Like when you're talking about borders crossing people, when Britain kind of became a commonwealth instead of an empire, suddenly people were drawing borders for, Pakistan and India were suddenly just partitioned into two separate countries, in Bangladesh and all these different things. It's like, and all over the Mideast they were redrawn. And UK had huge problems when it became a commonwealth because one of the rights of a citizen of the commonwealth was to come to UK, Britain, if you wanted to. You didn't have to have a passport. You didn't have to do any of that stuff. And then so suddenly, after the war particularly, all sorts of people were coming from Jamaica, from India, from wherever to the motherland, And the motherland was like, whoa, wait a minute. We didn't mean you come here to stay. And there were huge problems for a long time after that over there. So I think in a way their current problems are an extension of that rather than something new.
Yeah. Generations of people that are now Brits, but they're not island, the British Islands people. I just saw a series that I've been working on for several years, actually, maybe at least a couple of years. And it's in the country, in somewhere in England, but every time they find in the stop, it's very often either blacks or mixies. And as these kids walk around and find who's manning this store or who's getting married to whatever else, it's like it's normal too for them that they didn't used to have necessarily. I don't know. I don't know how long migration before the Second World War was as a natural flow as it might be today.
Well, if you just think about the history of England, I mean, they started out, I don't know who they were, if the Celtics were the original people or who, but, then all the various German tribes, and then the Normans and the Vikings, whatever. I don't have it in order, but.
Don't forget the Romans.
The Romans. But it's just part of history. I mean, it always has been.
Yeah, they just used to settle it in different ways back then, and it wasn't unfamiliar to just slaughter people or take over when you came in. You'd either be killed trying to come in or take over after you come in, and so
right.
UK has been basically ruled by French kings at various points, and so they have a very turbulent history right from the start. It's just been back and forth over there for a long time.
But yeah, if you think go ahead.
Oh no, I'm changing the subject a little bit, so go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, if you think of St. Patrick in Ireland, he was actually an immigrant. I mean, he was enslaved there, and
Mhm.
then he escaped, went back to Britain, and then he went back as a missionary. But he's like the icon of the Irish, and yet he's not Irish. I'm Irish, but he wasn't born and raised there.
Yeah. I just saw you know, a fact. UK migration, the year ending June 2022, 1.1 million people migrated into the UK, but 560,000 people immigrated from it,
Hmm.
with a net migration of about 500,000. Uh, I know that Brexit created a mess
Yeah, yeah.
for this too, right? The economics of that detachment made a huge difference on how and whether people wanted to stay anymore after they moved there to work.
Right.
Their biggest intake right now is from India, uh, and then Poland, and then Pakistan. So uh, for me, that's probably just chain migration. Poland is probably economic migration, but India and Pakistan is just a result of their continued uh, presence there. Uh, Today, 18% of the Brits are non-white.
Hmm.
And I also had this thing, was it my perception of this film? No. And of course, the migrants being part of the lower echelon of economic, of jobs, and then the top, right? Even the prime minister today of England being
Hmm.
non-white. So anyway, for positive and negative, there's that. I don't know what you guys think about uh, solutions or lessons that we get from those countries. And I'll start up with this. You guys remember when the Russians came,
Hmm.
colleagues that I'd met in
Mhm.
DC, and then we did a little sort of exchange, and they came. Of course, during that time, I had to learn quite a bit about how the Russian situation goes. And then as I went, uh, one of the things that they didn't like, and yet it seemed better than us, was that they divided the country into areas, decided how many jobs were not being filled, and a migrant could. They never called them immigrants for whatever reason. The migrants could apply to move to that region of Russia, of the Russian Federation, because the Russian Federation is the second net importer of migrants,
Hmm.
uh, because all the satellites, uh, the old Soviet satellites, both had received a lot of ethnic Russians, and they want to go back. I was there when the first invasion of the Ukraine came in, and there were a lot of Ukrainians, but they were really ethnically Russian. And Chupik and I went to the center, and she was handling them, and as a lawyer, trying to represent them and teach them what their real rights were, which were